Allora, con grande piacere vi presento il professor Michael Morris dell'Università del Sussex, UK. Chi di voi è venuto all'incontro dello scorso anno su Strawson potrà ricordarlo, perché abbiamo registrato un video in cui lui ci parlava della sua personale esperienza con il filosofo di Oxford e l'avevamo anche sottotitolato. Questa volta non ci saranno sottotitoli, e all'interno del ciclo su Wittgenstein, dove abbiamo affrontato diverse tematiche, dalla questione del realismo e la metafisica presente nel Tractatus, fino alla questione della matematica, i fondamenti della matematica e la normatività dei giochi linguistici, avremo il professor Michael Morris che ci parlerà trasversalmente del Tractatus e delle ricerche, concentrandosi su un tema a lui molto caro, che è la questione del realismo e dell'idealismo. Il professor Morris ha all'attivo numerosi articoli, diverse monografie, una ottima per quello che penso io, insomma, introduzione al Tractatus, un primo lavoro che si chiama The Good and the True, e anche un'introduzione alla filosofia del linguaggio. Quindi lascio la parola. Please.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't speak Italian. I'm sorry. I will try to speak English slowly and clearly and wave around and so on. We'll see how we go. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is the title of the talk. It's about the solipsism of the Tractatus. I say Tractatus, that's English. And the realism of the philosophical investigations. Okay. I don't know if you can read this. You've got it in front of you. It's the same words. Okay. But there is I missed a picture. You put an early version up. There's a later version with a picture. I'll tell you when the picture comes, and I'll tell you what's in the picture. But it doesn't matter. Right. So I'm going to use the words realism, idealism, and solipsism in a particular way. I don't know if it's the way you're used to, but I hope it makes sense. So realism, if you believe in realism, you think that the way things are is just independent of you. Okay, that's really the basic view. Okay, but here's a slightly more careful formulation. It's this thing R on your sheet up there, and it says the nature of the world as it is in itself is altogether independent of all thought about it, all representation of it, and you can add knowledge and all the rest as well. Okay? Now I've got two key terms here. One is this word, the world. Again, I'm understanding that in a very particular way. So what I have in mind is a whole range of intentional relations in roughly Husserl's sort of sense. Okay? So I can be thinking about my hand, I can look at my hand, I can attend to my hand, all those sorts of things, right? And the same can be true of all sorts of things, the ceiling, numbers, works of art, everything like that, okay? Now, whenever I think there's the possibility of knowledge, and indeed of not being known, then what you're thinking about, that counts as part of the world. That's what I mean, roughly by it. So I think that the world, as it's often used in my kind of philosophy, is a kind of general term for whatever you might have knowledge of, whatever's there to be thought about, that sort of thing. So sometimes there are thoughts over here, and if we're thinking about the window is part of the world. But if we then start thinking about our thoughts become part of the world. That's fine. Okay? So that's what that means. Now I'm just going to use also this other phrase, as it is in itself. That's a Kantian sort of phrase, and it's not meant quite in a Kantian sense. I'm using it in a slightly different way. I mean, I could say the nature of the world as it is in itself is altogether independent of all thought about it, or representation of it, and that would be a perfectly good expression of realism. That'd be fine, but I actually want to understand it in a slightly different way in order to allow they're not to be realism, in order to make sense of what an idealist says. So I've taken the world as it is in itself to be the world as independently of thought as possible. Okay? And the point of that, as possible, is to allow the possibility of someone who says, as independently as possible is not very independent. Okay? So that's the next thing. So here's idealist. The idealist says the nature of the world as it is in itself. So think of the world as independent of our thought and representation as possible. Even as independent as possible is not altogether independent. It depends a bit on thought and representation. And I'm now understanding solipsism in a particular sense. So it's not, solipsism is one where the particular individual, the individual subject gets involved. It's not just thought, it's not just representation, it's not just knowledge, it's not language, it's the individual subject. So this is the view that the nature of the world, as independently of us as is possible, depends in some way on me, my thoughts and representations. That's what it means. Okay? Not yours. Okay. Now this is the thing called the picture theory of the Tractatus. Here are two famous quotations which I'll explain in a minute. I don't know how well you know Wittgenstein, but what the Tractatus, this is a quick summary of the Tractatus. At the heart of it there is a theory of representation, or pictures, or models. And according to this theory, it says that it's only possible to represent something if it meets this condition. And then the claim is that language works in just the same way. And what that means is that you can't actually talk about the way that language represents things. And what that means is that all of this is nonsense. That's the story of the Tractatus in 2 sentences. All right? Okay. The core theory here is this. What he's saying is in the picture, the build, the model, the representation, and what is represented in the picture and the pictured. This is the old translation, the Ogden translation into English. There must be something identical in order that the one can be a picture of the other at all. And he then explains that a bit more carefully. What the picture must have in common with reality in order to be able to represent it after its manner, rightly or falsely, is its form of depiction. So what that's saying, I don't know what I've said in the next slide, what that's saying is that a picture can only picture something can only represent something else if the two things have the same form, if they share a form. That's the idea, right? The form of depiction. We'll explain what that means in a minute. He thinks the same applies to language. So language has to have the same form as reality if it's going to be possible to describe reality at all. For language to be about the world at all, language and the world must have the same form. This is a point he makes a bit later. I should have explained what that 1980 means. It's a series of lectures he gave in Cambridge in 1930, I think. And he says that grammar is a model of reality. He means syntax, what we would call syntax now. Okay? So that's a mirror of reality. Okay? And that is precisely the thesis of the Tractatus. This, even in 1930, it's more or less the same view. Okay? It changes a lot in the investigations, but here it is more or less the same view. Now in the Tractatus, form is all about possibility of combination. So the form of an object is just the way that object can combine with other objects. That's what it is for an object to have a form. He explains the form of a fact or the form of a picture slightly differently. Facts and pictures are a particular kind of fact, have elements. And those elements can be, in principle, combined with other things. A picture has a certain number of elements arranged in a certain way. He says their being arranged in that way is the structure of the fact or the picture. He calls it structure. That they can be arranged in that way, the possibility of arranging them in that way, is their form. Okay? So form is the possibility of structure. And form is always about ways in which things can be combined. And the kind of combination he has in mind is the way in which words can be combined together, at least in the most fundamental language. So he's talking about the way that words can be combined together to form sentences. That means syntax, roughly. Okay? And when he says that the form of language has to be the same as the form of the world, or the language in the world must share a form, must have the same form, it's syntax he's talking about. Okay? So he's saying that for language to be possible at all, the world must have something a bit like syntax. Something like that. A quasi-syntax, as I put it. Yeah, right? And that's the central claim of the picture theory of language in the Tractatus. He doesn't make it terribly explicitly, but that's what he means. Effectively, he says it's only possible for language to picture the world if syntax in language has a counterpart, a kind of quasi-syntax in the world, and the syntax of language is a sort of mirror of the quasi-syntax of the world. That's the idea. I'll say that, I don't know if that seems odd. It's actually everybody thinks something like it. Almost everybody. Not me, but almost everybody. Okay? So, I'm going to say a dangerous thing now. I think the whole tradition of the whole history of the concept of substance is about this issue. Okay? Because substance, when Aristotle first isolates the category of substance from the other categories, substances are in the first instance identified as the grammatical, syntactical subject. That's what substances are to begin with. They are the things which are not, the primary substance are the things which are not predicated of anything else. That is, they're neither said of anything else, nor are they in anything else. And the things which are in substances are things like qualities. So and qualities, of course, correspond to adjectives, predicates, other sorts of things. Okay? So straight away, that's a syntactical distinction he's making between roughly noun or name and adjective, and that then carries on with some kind of counterpart all the way through. And then the history of the concept of substance is the history of attempts to try to make sense of that something like that quasi-syntactical relation in non-syntactic terms. That's what the history of the concept of substance is, I think. Initially in Aristotle, to do with ontological independence and dependence, and then later on various other sorts of things. But that later. So everybody has it. So even Frege, for example, Wittgenstein's hero, really. The Tractatus, I can't remember the exact words of the preface, I've got it there. He begins in the preface by saying, if one person reads this and takes pleasure from it, I'll be content, something like that. And the person in particular he wanted to take pleasure from it was Frege. But Frege didn't understand it at all, and he didn't like it, and it was a very sad thing. But Frege, you remember, Frege has a wholly syntactic conception of reality. So Frege thinks that there are objects and there are concepts. For Frege, an object is just whatever's referred to by a name or singular term, and a concept is just whatever's referred to by a concept word or predicate, something like that, in his logic. But you can see there that he's giving in a different way a kind of quasi-syntax in the world. He says that objects are complete or saturated, whereas concepts are incomplete or unsaturated. And that's a counterpart exactly to the syntactic properties that he thought that names and predicates had in language. Okay, so that's the central thesis of the Tractatus. Now, so what we have here is a kind of correspondence in the Tractatus view. We've got the form of language, syntax, and we have the form of the world, a kind of quasi-syntax. It's the same. That's the claim, okay? And that means that for it to be the same, that just means that the way that words can be arranged in sentences is exactly the same as the way in which the corresponding objects can be arranged in facts. Okay, that's the view. Okay. Now, it's a common view. The clearest exponent of it is David Pear's, that the picture theory of the Tractatus expresses a form of realism. Okay, so the idea on this view is that the form of reality is fixed there as having a certain form, and that's fixed independently of any picture of it, and the form of language is just, as it were, language is just copied from that and inherits the form of the world. Okay, so world first, language second. World independent of language and merely a reflection of it. Okay, that's David Pear's view of the Tractatus. It's also a common view that in the later work, in the philosophical investigations in particular, Wittgenstein adopted a form of idealism, a form of linguistic idealism in particular. This is a view expressed by, for example, Bernard Williams and Jonathan Lear, that, as it were, language. This will be a more particularly Fregean view, I think, actually, but it's a view that we can only ever talk about a kind of linguistic world, and the linguistic world is quite a large one in a way, because it includes not just the words but the whole kind of form of life that goes with the words. But this is a world, in a sense, constructed with the language. That's the view that Williams and Jonathan Lear attribute to Wittgenstein in the later period, in the philosophical investigations. Now, my view is that it's just the other way around. Okay? So I think that Tractatus is an idealist work, specifically solipsist work, and the investigations is a realist work. Okay? So I think it's just the other way around. Okay? Right? And I'm not sure I'll convince you of that, but I'll just make some initially plausible claims. Okay. Or claims that I think, okay. Now, here's the obvious reason for thinking that Tractatus is an idealist work. It's a solipsist work, and on my view, solipsism is just a special kind of idealism. This is because these two paragraphs of section 5.62 of the Tractatus, where he says, in fact, what solipsism means is quite correct, only it cannot be said, but it shows itself. We'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. And then he then offers an argument for that in the next paragraph. Okay, so he doesn't just say it in some sense. He argues for it. He says that the world is my world shows itself in the fact that the limits of language And the text here is a bit of a mess, but what he means is the only language which I understand, that's what the German there mean the limits of my world. Okay? Right. And then in the next section he says, I am my world, the microcosm. And then a bit later he then goes on to say, here we see that solipsism, strictly carried out, coincides with pure realism. The I in solipsism shrinks to an extensionless point, and there remains the reality coordinated with it. Okay, I'm going to mostly now look at this remark, then maybe try to interpret this remark, but I'll have in the back of my mind an argument that people have made on the basis of that remark. Okay, it won't take very long. Nothing I think ever does. There we are. So 5.62. Here it was. That key paragraph. In fact, what solipsism means is quite correct, and yet cannot be said, but it shows itself. So here, he seems to say three things. First, what solipsism means is quite correct. Secondly, what solipsism means cannot be said. And thirdly, what solipsism means shows itself. Now, I won't worry at all about the third thing. It's actually very confusing. You can ask about it if you like, but it's very odd and very difficult to work out what he means there. I mean, what he means by showing in general, I think I do know, but what he means by here is very strange, and I don't know quite. It's a kind of gesture, I think. So he says these three things, apparently. First, what solipsism means is quite correct. Secondly, what solipsism means cannot be said. And thirdly, that it shows itself. Just the first two that I'll look at. Now, there are two kinds of interpretation of these remarks. Interpretation A, it says that Wittgenstein is in a way asserting one, in spite of two. So he is kind of saying what solipsism means is quite correct, even though he says what solipsism means can't be said. Okay? So there's something like a contradiction there, but nevertheless, according to the first interpretation, interpretation A, he really is trying to say that, even though that's true also. Okay? That's the sort of thing, right? Okay? Now the other interpretation, B, says he's not really saying anything at all. So he's not saying that what solipsism means is quite correct, because if he were to do that, he would be saying something which couldn't be said, and he says it can't be said, right? Right? That's the alternative interpretation. Right? The second interpretation, the B interpretation, really the best version of that, I think is, I can't remember the name of the paper, but it's Brian McGuinness. It's very funny, you'll know that the more recent, perhaps you don't know English translations of the Tractatus. There are two famous English translations of the Tractatus. One, apparently by Ogden, although probably by Frank Ramsey, who was a 19-year-old mathematics student at the time. The Ogden one, which is the one it was published with, so in the original edition in 1922, there was the German on one page and the English on the other, and it was Ogden's English, or Ramsey's English. And then there was a later one, about 1961, I think, with David Pears and Brian McGuinness. And they're very, very different interpreters of Wittgenstein. David Pears he's a kind of British empiricist. He's a Russell scholar. He's more at home in Russell than in Wittgenstein. And you'll see in a minute, he interprets the Tractatus in, it seems to me, a very odd way, actually. McGuinness is much, much more subtle, and I think a greater scholar, although probably it wouldn't have got done if it hadn't been for Pears. So the two of them are quite an interesting pair. So the second interpretation is that he's not really saying that solipsism is what solipsism means is quite correct, because that would be trying to say something that couldn't be said. Okay? So I said McGuinness is really the best of the people who take that line, I think. Pears takes a very extraordinary version of it. He takes that somehow or other, that is not asserting that what solipsism means is quite correct. He takes that to be a way of being a realist, okay? Because of that thing I've earlier quoted, 5.64, here we see that solipsism carried out coincides with pure realism. Hooray! We can be realists, okay? The I in solipsism shrinks to an extensionless point, and there remains the reality coordinated with it. So Pears thinks, hey, because you can't say solipsism, realism is true. Hooray! Okay, that's mad. Because if you can't say solipsism, you can't say realism either. So it really is a very strange view. You wouldn't find McGuinness saying that, I think. Okay. Now my own view is that although I understand the subtlety of those who accept option B, it seems to me obvious that option A is right. Because, as we've seen, look what he says! He says, in fact, what solipsism means is quite correct. Okay? Well, okay, if he was just not going to say anything, why did he say that? Why did he say that rather than anything else at all in the world? He said that because he's a kind of solipsist, I think. And he even, as I've said, gives you an argument for it. Okay? That's an argument for solipsism. I think I'm breaking your rule. Okay. So, although the people who hold option B are wise and subtle, they're wrong. Okay, it's option A. It has to be option A. Otherwise, you can't see why he would have mentioned solipsism at all. Okay. Now, here are two versions of the same form thesis. Okay. Let me just lay out the realist interpretation and the idealist interpretation. Okay. The realist interpretation is this: that language has the form it has because the world has the form it has, okay? The explanation goes that way. Language is like this because the world is like that. World first, then language, okay? Language like that because of the world. The idealist view just goes the other way. The world has the form it has that kind of quasi-syntax because language has the form it has, okay? Now I think myself, this is just me, okay? I think that the realist view is no good. This is not talking about Wittgenstein yet. This is just lots of people in the whole history of philosophy have held some version of the same form thesis, back to Aristotle at least, okay? And some of them have tried to be realistic about it. And I think it's no good. I won't go into an attack on the whole history of the concept of substance and all the mistakes all the way through. But the problem is, basically, that we have no idea at all of what it would be for the world to have a kind of quasi-syntax, except as a kind of counterpart of a sort we don't quite understand of the syntax of language. So all those attempts by Aristotle and everybody else to try to construct a counterpart to syntax in non-syntactic terms, so ontological dependence and independence, for example, set membership, I think, which is basically Berkeley's view or Locke's view, perhaps Leibniz's view, and various others, they just don't work. They just don't work. They always, in fact, presuppose the distinction they're trying to get, and they don't ever really get there. Spinoza would be another one. who is in trouble there. But he's a kind of rationalist Aristotelian, I suppose, in my view, on this matter. Now, the problem with that means that because we have no grip on what it would be for the world to have a quasi-syntax, except as a reflection of language, we can't make sense of the explanatory relation that the realist view has in mind. We can't think of how the syntax of the world might explain the syntax of language, because we've no idea what the syntax of the world might look like. It's just a kind of magic theory. It's just no idea how it happens. It's kind of like those people who think that creation, I guess, is an anti-religious remark. Not really, but in a superficial sense. Those people who think that creation explains everything, it doesn't explain anything because you don't know how it works. It's just magic. That's not an explanation. And the same thing is here. That's not an explanation. You've got no idea what's going on. So the whole point of the realist view is to get the kind of explanation going, but you don't know what it means. It's just magic. So I think that's silly. You've got no reason to believe that one. The only way I think you can make sense of the world having the same form as language is in the idealist view. That is, that the form of the world is a kind of projection from language. And that's roughly Frege's view, I think. And I think it's clearly a version of what Wittgenstein's doing. Now, if you actually look at the argument, here's the argument. That the world is my world shows itself in the fact that the limits of the language, that is to say, the only language which I understand, mean the limits of my world. And he means something like, by limits, he means something like syntax, actually. He means something like the range of possibilities. What actually can be set up, what can be constructed in the system, okay? And this looks like an argument for saying that, okay, that the possibilities in the world are, as it were, what are meant by the possibilities in language, okay? But it's not just language, but my language. And the question is, why that? And I think it's just this. I think Wittgenstein's thinking something like this. That I think he thinks that that language works by roughly two stages, although they may only be capable of being carried out in one go, by roughly two stages of stipulation, of determination by someone. So one stipulation is to say, this word or these words are to have this kind of syntax. We will declare they can be arranged like this. I will accept these arrangements and no others, right? That's the first stage. And then the second stage of stipulation is to say, this word will stand for that thing, okay? So roughly speaking, two stages of stipulation, although maybe they can only be carried out together. There are hints in the Tractatus of separating those. Now he doesn't talk about that very much in the Tractatus, but this looks like something from a little earlier. This is the Notes on Logic, dictated G.E. Moore in 1913, something like that, just before the First World War. He writes this: I now determine, he doesn't believe in these formulations later, but it gives you an idea of how he's thinking. I now determine the sense of X, R, Y by laying down, a stipulation, when the facts behave in regard to X, R, Y, so that the meaning of X stands in the relation R to the meaning of Y, then I say that the facts are of like sense with the proposition X, R, Y, otherwise of opposite sense. So they're the ones I'm just declaring what counts as confirming it. I correlate the facts to the symbol x, r, y by thus dividing them into those of like sense and those of opposite sense. Now this isn't quite what I need, but it's in the right direction, because this suggests that what you have here is language set up by stipulation, and stipulation by one person, I. Okay, I now determine, I correlate. And that's what I think is going on. So he seems to think that, this is a view that other people have thought before, that the basic languages are the languages of individuals, sometimes called idiolects. So there's my language, and then there's your language, and each of you has a different language, and then for you, the Italian language is some kind of combination of what you all agree on, and the English language is some kind of combination of what I agree on with other English speakers and the rest of it. Okay? So there are two moves here. One is thinking each person's language is more fundamental than the language of a community or a country or a culture. And secondly, thinking that each person's language is basically determined by stipulation. Right? So it's not each individual therefore, and that's what I think is happening here. So the argument, roughly, is that that's what he's saying here. That the world is my world shows itself in the fact that the limits of the language, that is to say, the syntax of the language, that is to say, the language, my language, mean the limits of the world, correspond to determine the limits of the world. Okay? And I think that's an individual stipulation, and that's what's going on. So I think that a really clear case, he's clearly some sort of idealist, because he says, in fact, what solipsism means is quite correct, and I think you can see this argument for it is a version of the sort of argument that I think it has to be, that effectively you're taking the world, the form of the world, the syntax of the world, to be a projection of the syntax of language created when language is, as it were, stipulated to behave as it should by an individual. And that's the evidence that he does that. Okay, I've just done that. Good. Now, so much for the Tractatus. I've just said, okay, the first part of the title was the solipsism of the Tractatus. You've just had that. That's the solipsism of the Tractatus. He's a solipsist. That's it. Okay? Now we're going to go on to the realism of the investigations. As you know, I'm just going to look really at two bits of the investigations. This, and in a little bit, the rule-following considerations from a bit later on. Right, yeah. Okay, so as you know, the philosophical investigations begins with a view that Wittgenstein wants to reject. This is the latest English translation. I can't remember exactly who did it. It's an updated version. So it goes like this. This is what Augustine says. This is Augustine pretending to remember first learning his first language. Okay, right? He had a better memory than anybody else if he remembered that. But there he is, pretending to remember it. When grown-ups named some object and at the same time turned towards it, I perceived this and I grasped that the thing was signified by the sound they uttered, since they meant to point it out. This, however, I gathered from their gestures, the natural language of all peoples, the language that by means of facial expression and the play of the eyes, of the movement of the limbs and the tone of the voice, indicates the affections of the soul when it desires or clings to or rejects or recoils from something. In this way, little by little, I learnt to understand what things, the words, which I heard uttered in their respective places in various sentences, signified. And once I got my tongue around these signs, I use them to express my own wishes, my wishes. Okay? So that's the latest translation of a very famous passage. Okay? Now, this is very clearly something. Here is something that Augustine is really clearly committed to. I've called it Aug to indicate it's what Augustine is committed to. So we've got to imagine a child, okay, doesn't speak at all, doesn't know anything, but still there's something they can do. Before undertaking the task of learning a language at all, the learner, the child, can identify objects in the environment as things fit to be named. Okay? This clearly, I think, commits Augustine to some form, some version of the same form assumption of the picture theory on its realist interpretation. So effectively, that thing, Aug, involves a version of this, that language has the form it has because the world has the form it has. There are all the things in the world, I can see them one by one, I see what they're talking about, I attach the words to the things. That's how it all goes. It's just the same. It's a very clear expression of a realist version of the same form assumption of the Tractatus. It's cruder than the theory of the Tractatus, but it's a version of, it has this in common with it. Now, in section 32, Wittgenstein writes, after some intervening stuff, and now I think we can say, Augustine describes the learning of human language as if the child came into a foreign country and did not understand the language of the country. That is, as if he already had a language, only not this one. Okay? So, effectively, what Wittgenstein here seems to be claiming, W, thesis 1, it's only possible to identify an object as something fit to be named from the point of view of the speaker of a language. So it's only once you can speak a language that you can recognize an object as fit to be named. That's what he seems to be saying. Okay? Now, one possibility, of course, is that he's there endorsing a form of idealism, very like the one I found in the Tractatus. So the Tractatus person would also have rejected the Augustinian view for several reasons, but this one in particular, because on my understanding, the Tractatus Wittgenstein is an idealist. Okay? And he thinks that although the world does have the same form as language, it can't be identified independently of language. That's the thought, right? So what Augustine imagines is that you can see the objects all in their nice ontological categories in advance of language, and you just tie the words up with them. Okay? But the Tractatus, as I understand it, thinks that the ontological categories of the objects are only determined by the language which you then use. So the Tractatus would reject the Augustinian picture too. Okay? But I think for a different reason. Not for this reason, that the Augustinian picture is realist, whereas the Tractatus is idealist, but for a different one, which is this, that the world itself, or the world as it is in itself, does not come already divided into objects fit to be named. That is to say, there is a world independent of our language, and that world, the real world, does not come already fit to be named. And that's a form of realism, but it rejects the same form assumption. Okay? So it's a rejection of the picture theory. I think that's what he means. Now, why would we think that he thinks this rather than thinking a form of idealism? Well, here's one reason. He says at section 104, And this does have only a very local, it does have a local relevance, but I think it's more generally relevant, and I'll explain why. He says, one predicates of the thing what lies in the mode of presentation. Actually, I think it may have been mode of representation. I may have miscopied that. I think it's mode of representation, not mode of... That's Frege. Okay, I think it's mode of representation. I can check it in a minute. And that is, of course, exactly what's gone wrong if you think that. So there is such a thing as syntax, okay? Ordinary languages have a syntax, but the world doesn't have one, okay? To think the world has something like a syntax is to predicate of the world what lies in the mode of representation, okay? That is what's going on. Now I'm understanding that to have a very general significance, this one remark at section 104. And you might doubt that, but I'm going to give further support for that from this strange thing. This is three very famous sentences from I nearly pulled that over. Three very famous sentences from what used to be called Part 2 of the Philosophical Investigations, but now in the latest edition is called something different, Philosophy of Psychology, a fragment. Okay, and this is a new translation of them, although the idea is familiar. So, first sentence is this: I can know what someone else is thinking, not what I am thinking. Notice that that really is Wittgenstein's view. It's a very odd view. Most people don't think that, but Wittgenstein does. That's exactly what he says in about 243 or so of the Investigations. Okay? I can know what someone else is thinking, not what I'm thinking, right? And then second sentence, it's correct to say, I know what you're thinking, and wrong to say, I know what I'm thinking, right? And then he puts in brackets, famously, a whole cloud of philosophy condenses into a drop of grammar. Okay, so here's the idea. The second sentence is a translation of the first sentence. The first sentence says, I can know what someone else is thinking, but I can't know what I'm thinking. Translation, it's correct to say, I know what you're thinking, and wrong to say, I know what I'm thinking, right? And then the third sentence is an account of that. That is to say, that's a whole cloud of philosophy, and here's a drop of grammar into which it condenses. Okay, I'll say a bit about what grammar means in a minute. Just trying to remember what the next slide is. I'll do it all now. Okay. Now, the whole cloud of philosophy, the important thing about this is that this can. That's a statement of what is possible. So it's exactly the kind of thing which form was about in the Tractatus. In the Tractatus, the whole point of the notion of form is that's where possibility comes in. And the reason why he cares about that is that possibility and necessity, which is at heart of the whole Kantian project, partly for Wittgenstein as carried on into Schopenhauer, but really by the Tractatus itself, it's Kant in particular that he's concerned with. So this looks like a statement of what is possible and what is impossible. So it's about modality, possibility, and necessity. And it seems to be about what's possible, what's really possible. I really can know what someone else is thinking, and I really can't know what I'm thinking. All right? That's to say, it's what Kant would call a synthetic a priori truth. Okay? It's a priori because it's about necessity and possibility, and it's synthetic because it's about what's really possible and necessary in the world. Okay? It's not just analytic. And then the translation says, this kind of possibility and necessity is really just about grammar. It's just about the rules for using words, in particular the word no. Okay? According to Wittgenstein, you can only properly use the word no when there is the possibility of doubt, when doubt makes sense. He thinks doubt makes sense when it's you, when it's about your thinking, but it doesn't make sense when it's about what I think. Alright? So now, just think about what's going on there. Effectively, he's saying that's right. That's fine. Effectively, what he's saying is we have a picture there of the world as it is, and then the grammar that we bring to it. The grammar is not reflected in the world. Okay, that's the grammar just comes with our language, and this ties up with some of the stuff you come later, where he says that grammar, indeed, actually he says in Investigations, grammar is arbitrary, and that's surely one of the points of the notion of a language game, which is such a big thing in the Investigations. You can have any grammar you like. Grammar is not determined by the world. The way the words are run is not determined by the world. But that requires the world to be a certain way, independently of language, and then there's the way that language is used, which is relative to the world, arbitrary. We can have any grammar we like, in principle. Okay. That's the idea. And that just seems to me another clear statement of realism of the relevant kind. It looks as if what we've got here is that we've got a denial of the same form thesis and a kind of realism about the world independently of the form of language. So that's what's going on there, I think. I'm now going to... All right, a bit more time? Yeah. I'm now going to give you another argument for the same view, okay? In the one of the things one puzzles about is what does it mean to say that language and world have the same form? What does that mean? It's part of the problem that we don't have an idea of what it would be for the world to have a kind of quasi-syntax. Well, in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein was clearly, I think, puzzled by the same thing as well. This is, I think, what he means by this section. He's talking about the idea that a symphony, a score, and a gramophone record, this would have been pre-electrical recording, okay? He's talking about 1918. There weren't even electric microphones then, okay? This is pre-electric recording he's talking about, but it still works. So the music, the symphony, the score, and the gramophone record. He wants to say these all effectively have the same form, right? Because each is a representation of the one before. And this is what he explains. This is how he explains what that means. He says, in the fact that there is a general rule by which the musician is able to read the symphony out of the score, and that there's a rule by which one can reconstruct the symphony from the line on the gramophone record, and from this again, by means of the first rule, construct the score, herein lies the internal similarity, same as the form, between these things which at first sight seem to be entirely different. And the rule is the law of projection, which projects the symphony into the language of the musical score. It's the rule of translation of this passage into the language of the gramophone record. And roughly what this means is that if language and world have the same form, there has to be a rule for translating one into the other, roughly speaking. Okay? Now this was the point when I was going to show you a picture in the later version of the slides. It's a picture of a town, the nearest significant town to where I live. I live in a tiny village with about 70 houses. The nearest town is a town called Lewes, and I was going to show you a picture of Lewes Castle. It has a castle in it, so there's a 12th century, so it's 1100s castle, and it's on a hill. Okay, and Lewis is very hilly. Okay, that's what you need to know. Lewis is hilly. Okay, right. So here's a rule for using a sentence of English. Okay, the sentence "Lewis is hilly" is true if and only if Lewis is indeed hilly. Right? Okay. Now, in other contexts, we might think of the work of Donald Davidson, Truth and Meaning, things like that. The point of a rule like that will be that what it says can in principle be understood by someone who doesn't understand that English sentence, or even who doesn't understand English at all. So the idea would be that you could state in Italian what that rule says. So you'd use an Italian words here for a sentence. You then use the English words, Lewis is hilly, and then you say, in Italian, is true if and only if Lewis is hilly, with Italian there too, right? So you could understand what that rule says, even if you don't yet understand English. I say yet, but the moment you understand that, you've understood that bit of English. That's the idea, okay? That's Davidson's theory of language, that you understand, if you understand that, that's enough to understand the English sentence. And you can get there from a position where you don't understand the English sentence. Okay? And I think the idea is that the fact on the right, Lewis being hilly, that's something you can get just from the world. You just look, and if you got the slide, you'd have seen a great big hill with the castle on top. That's Lewis, I'd say, right? And you can see it's hilly. Okay, so you just look and you can see it's hilly, right? And given that, you know that it's true, okay? And you're away, okay? So you've got a simple rule which takes you from the fact, which you can just see, if I'd shown you the picture, to the truth of the sentence, okay? Right? Now that's the key thing, that that's a clear relation between the world as it might be given in perception. You just look at the picture, you can see that Lewis is hilly, and then you know straight away the sentence is okay, because the sentence just says that, right? Right? So that's the thought, that's the rule of translation. So now, here's another interpretation of what's going on in the same form assumption. The Tractatus thinks that language and the world have the same form. That bit about gramophone records and symphonies tells you what that means is there's a rule which takes you from the world to language, right? You just need a rule, okay? There's a rule like that, okay? So it's another way of saying that Davidson has a theory like Wittgenstein's. It's the same form theory, okay? Now, that's what Wittgenstein in the investigations clearly does not believe. Some of you may know that there's a long stretch in the investigations running from about 130 something up to about 240, about 100 sections, called the rule following considerations, when he's concerned with what it is to follow a rule. This has been the source of a very famous book by Saul Kripke, Wittgenstein on Rules in Private Language. And Kripke understands Wittgenstein as posing a paradox here. Kripke's paradox, the paradox that Kripke finds in Wittgenstein, is this: what about the way I've used words could justify my using the word in a certain way? So he's looking for something which you can tell, without yet understanding the words, would justify the use of words, right? Well, and that produces a paradox. Well, actually, the general trend of that stuff, the rule-following consideration, is just to say he's asking the wrong question. Kripke's understanding of Wittgenstein is just completely wrong. Wittgenstein is not asking for that kind of justification. Indeed, he's trying to show that you can't have it. That's the point of those sections, right? And that's to say we can't be operating with a rule like that, because that interpretation is exactly the one which leads Kripke into trouble, and which almost certainly is Wittgenstein is rejecting. And if that's right, then even in the rule-following considerations, Wittgenstein is rejecting the same form assumption and taking it that there's the world independently of language, realist about the world, but it doesn't have the same form as language. And that's it.